I'd like to introduce you and have you welcome Scott Mathiasen, who is with us today. So let's give a faith welcome to Scott.
Good morning. Good morning. It feels incredibly vulnerable for me to be out front like this. I was telling Denise that my strong preference is usually to hide behind the piano and at least be only partially exposed. But for some reason, Pastor Lee asked that I just speak today and not hide behind the piano. So I got up early, and for some reason I was sort of nudged awake at about 4 a.m. and so I got up and went over my notes and then got ready and took off and drove about an hour and a half. And all the way over here I kept pulling out my notes and peeking and thinking, I can't say that, I should say that, and got a little obsessive. And then I noticed on my dashboard this little red warning light that came on, that kind of comes on off and on as my Jeep is getting a little older, and it's the airbag alert. And so I took that as a sign from God to not be an airbag today. So I'm going to try to focus and stay on task and tell you a bit of my story, tell you a bit of God's story in me. Why don't we pray before we start? Father, you are above all, and you are in all. And this morning, we have this brief moment of time where we come together and we need each other and we need you. And as we spend the next few minutes, I ask that somehow in the mix of this, your Spirit move in us and speak to us, to find its way past our defenses, some of which are caused by our own wounds and our own brokenness. Help us to trust you to let your Spirit in and to do its work that needs to be done in our hearts this morning. In Jesus' name. Let's take a look at the text for the day, which I think is on the screen. I'm going to read it from my notes just because I'm afraid of turning around too much and strangling myself with these cords. So this is found in 2 Corinthians 1, starting with verse 3 through verse 7. Praise be to God, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all of our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. If we are distressed, it is for your comfort and salvation. If we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which produces in you patient endurance for the same sufferings we suffer. And our hope for you is firm, because we know that just as you share in our sufferings, so also we share in our comfort. A little over 27 years ago, I was one moment on top of a scaffolding, 35 feet up, painting a wooden chimney casing above a walkout basement and first story in the roof line, when the soft April clay of Michigan gave way and the scaffold settled just enough to tip away from the house and left me with nothing under my feet. And I dropped 30-some feet in just a mere second and broke my back at the L1 level and lay instantly paralyzed on the ground. So all of the stuff that happens from a moment of impact, the call to the ambulance, the ride to the hospital, the admission through the ER, all of that stuff to me is a blur. I remained conscious the entire time, but still somewhat of a blur. So assessments were made, decisions were made, parents were called, sisters were called, people rushed to my side. And surgery was done to repair things as well as the doctors at the time could repair me. And then I went to intensive care, where I stayed for a number of days. 7, I think, to be exact. And during that time, after surgery, they placed me in one of those beds that rotates, and not the kind that rotate, you know, I call them handicapped nightmare movies, you know, where they put you in and turn you all the way over. Mine just, I was strapped in like this, a little bit like a scarecrow lying on his back, and it would rotate from side to side, 30 degrees to the right, 30 degrees to the left. Each rotation took 8 minutes. And I was in that bed for a number of days to hold my body stable while the fusion in my spine started to set and they could cast my torso, which is a great thing because it prevented me from getting pressure sores on my backside. But one of the things that happened in the course of that 7 days, those 7 days in intensive care, was that as I rotated from side to side, as I got to that 30-degree angle, every part of my body was totally immobilized, except my head, which had about this much room on each side for my ears. And so when I would get to that side, there would be just a slight bump as it turned me back, which was okay when I was awake. But when I was trying to sleep, I would have like 7.5 minutes, 7 3/4 minutes, and then there would be a slight bump. And every time that bump happened on each side, there was just enough of a sort of impact that I would relive the impact of the fall. So for 7 days, or 7 nights mostly, I went through that. Plus I had morphine. I had lots of morphine. And so it was kind of a mess. But what happened over the course of those 7 days was that I never really went through an entire sleep cycle and got any rest. And so a condition started to develop called sleep psychosis, which is I started having symptoms of being psychotic, out of touch with reality. And so my doctors decided to call psychology from upstairs, and a psychology intern came to fix me. And I'm a counselor, by the way, now, so I'm a little sarcastic about that. But so this psychology intern came in, and she was going to take on this process for me to try to get me in a better place with the process of visualization. And so she tried to this guided imagery thing to take me to a place of comfort and peace and quiet and all of that. So I found myself up on the shores of Michigan. I was in Michigan at the time in school. I found myself up on the shores of Michigan at a place called Wildflower Bay, which was right on the thumb. There's this bay in Michigan, and that's where I was. And I was sailing with my friends, and sitting on the shore in a chaise lounge, splashing my feet in the water, the smell of the water, the sound of seagulls, the laughter of children down the shore. And it was very peaceful all of a sudden, for the first time in some 7 days. I had sort of escaped from my pain and my confusion and my anger and my disbelief. So there I was, skimming stones on the shore, and all of a sudden, I could only stay there for so long, and then the waters around me started turning red again, and then there were like sinews and muscles and torn muscles that started swimming through the water as it turned more red, and then I was just sort of overtaken again by all of that confusion and pain and disbelief. And so it worked for a little bit. That psychology resident was, in effect, she gave me like a 3-minute escape from my reality. So over the coming months, I tried to utilize that technique again. When I needed a chance, when I started to get overwhelmed with the details of rehab and my paralysis and trying to do something to reach out to this God that I had spent my whole life believing in. So looking back on that, I sort of developed this coping technique, which I call skimming stones or skipping stones, depending on where you're from. People call it different things. But that's kind of how I learned how to cope for a while. When I was in rehab, I was in rehab for 2 months, and then in an outpatient stuff for about 5 weeks after that. And then I spent quite some time after that hanging out with physical terrorists, as I called them. But all during that time, I did the skipping stones technique, which was this. I would take some small, smooth stone of faith, of belief, of hope, and I would invest all my energy in it, and I would get parallel to the water, and I would just invest this energy and do everything I could to stay on top of the water. Which, on a good skipping stones day, if the water's calm and you're feeling especially strong and balanced and focused, you can get 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 skips across the water. But inevitably, you end up on the bottom. And that's how it was for me for a long time. I would take little bits of faith that I had grown up believing in, little promises, and they were smooth and they were small, and I would do anything I could to keep those above water, to keep my head above water. And it worked. It kind of worked for a while. But it didn't work forever. And sooner or later, I don't know if I got exhausted or if I just got, I don't know, if I just started to relax a little bit. But I realized that I was spending great amounts of energy just to keep splashing across the surface of being positive and okay and faithful and a good little church boy who believed that somehow God was going to bring good out of this, or that he in fact was bringing good out of it in the moment. I hung on to things like Romans 8:28. For God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. That was a verse of my childhood that I had memorized. Or James chapter 1, consider it all joy when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Those kinds of things. Those were these things that just kind of, I hung on to them. I tried to keep them going, but I found something in perspective. God causes all things to work together for good. On this side of a trauma, a difficulty, brokenness, a wound, looks very different than God causes all things to work together for good. On this side of the brokenness, wound, and trauma. It's an easy thing to say that, really. It was, for me, it was an easy thing to say that as I memorized it in childhood and adolescence. But then when all things become nasty, difficult, confusing things, that promise starts to look different. Doesn't change the promise necessarily, but it certainly changes the perspective. And so I got to this point where I started doing, as Henry Cloud would say, that I adopted this thing, reality. Reality is always our friend. I spent a lot of time in fantasy, I think, up to that point where I was in fact paralyzed, and my neurologist told me that I would be paralyzed for life, so get used to it. My orthopedic surgeon said, you're partially paralyzed, your spinal cord wasn't severed, so work your tail off. Who knows what you could do? You may walk, you may do a cane, you may do a walker. Give it all you've got. And so I was caught between this neurologist and this orthopedic surgeon saying, get used to it, sit down and go on with your life. Or figure out a way to invest everything you have. So I had that. I was caught in the tension between those two things. But over time, praying for healing, asking God for strength, asking God for a miracle. As time passed, I started to realize, or at least I thought that I realized, maybe what I really want is not going back to things. And so reality became my friend. The reality that I might just be paralyzed for the rest of my life to some degree. And that my prayers would not necessarily be answered the way that I wanted them to be answered. And so I had to find purpose in this. I came across a quote from a book called First You Have to Row a Little Boat, written by Richard Bode, which is not a Christian book, but it's practical life lessons that this man Richard learned while learning to sail. Things that he learned about the life around us, the earth around us, gravity, wind, water, all of that stuff. I think there's a slide for this, but I think I'm blind. Okay. This may seem like an obscure quote, but I'm going to jump into it. When she floated at her mooring post, she immersed herself as far as her waterline. Who had calculated how deep a boat should sink, how high she might float, and how much sea she should displace? This became kind of a metaphor for me, partly because I'm a visual guy, and when I read this, I can see a boat tied in the harbor to its mooring post. And I've taken lots of pictures of stuff like that over the years because it always reminds me of this. And so I think about this whole thing in the context of being people as we are, who are drawn to God and drawn by God to be followers of Christ. What does that mean? What does that mean in the world that we live in? Because honestly, I grew up with a certain subtle but powerful theology that came my way that kind of said if you come to God, if you come to Jesus, that there's a promise of abundant life. And somehow, there's sort of, the closer you are to Him, the better your life's going to be. And so I grew up with that, and maybe I misinterpreted it in some ways. But when you grow up with that kind of thought, and lots of life experience that really kind of proved that to me in some ways, and then the scaffold tips over, and you find yourself laying on the ground, paralyzed. How do you make sense of that? For me, how did I make sense of that? Because on the one hand, I had all of this pain and brokenness and woundedness and disappointment and disillusionment. I had that. And then I had all of this life experience and belief and just knowing in my heart that God wanted the best for me. And that He loved me. And that He heard my prayers and that He answered my prayers. And that there was purpose in my life. All things work together for good. And I had these two things, these two lumps of stuff in my opposing hands that did not seem to make sense together. I couldn't fit it together very well. And yet it was my reality. I was at war with myself. One dynamic that I have, when I look back over some 27 years of paralysis and trying to make sense of my life, is that it seems like this. It seems like God is trying to do this sort of scheme. And this goes along with the waterline theme, how deep we're immersed, how high we float, how much sea we displace. Because I think that God is at least for me, God is in the business of pushing me deeper into my own heart, deeper into the heart of humanity, you and me, and deeper into His own heart. Those three dynamics are what helps me make sense of being a paralyzed person, caught in a system of faith, living in a world that's also broken, but believing and looking to God for a sense of purpose and healing and abundance. I think that a lot of us are afraid of those three movements of God in our life. Of Him pushing us deeper into our own heart, deeper into the heart of humanity, and deeper into His own heart. I talked to a pastor friend of mine not long ago in Springfield who he was a pastor who married my wife and I. And I was talking to him about some of these dynamics, and I said, I'm talking about going deeper, Jeff. And he said, honestly, he said to me, I don't always want to be deeper. I don't always want to go deeper. And then he proceeded to tell me that he and his church staff had just gotten back from a staff retreat, and he had posed the question to all of his staff, what is it about the church that annoys you the most? And and all of his staff in their own little, I think they wrote on note cards, because like I'd be too afraid to say this to my senior pastor if I was on his staff. But he said that all of the people on his staff somehow brought this message back on their little note cards, that the thing that annoys them, one of the things that annoys them the most about the church is a shallow Christianity. Oh, okay, so I don't know if that's just a bunch of pastors being all judgmental on their congregation, or if that's really a true thing they see, you know? And so I think, okay, so how do we live deep? How do we live shallow? What does that mean for us? The answer for me really lies in the scripture in 2 Corinthians. That we live in relationship to, we believe in a God who is the Father of compassion, the God who is the God of all comfort. And so, what's the point in us just getting that from him? You know, there's part of a point there. Here we are, hurt, broken, troubled people. We go to God, he gives us comfort, he gives us compassion. That's great. I think that sometimes our shallowness comes in right there. Because I think a lot of us choose to stop there. God has comforted us. God has given us compassion. Thank you. It's awesome. But I think he asks way more of us than that, just to receive his comfort and compassion. So let's go back. Like, I'm totally off script, and I am totally unaware of time. So I'm going to do that. There's like no clocks in here. Does Lee do this so he doesn't have to stop? Okay. So let's go back to the boat. When she floated out of her mooring post, she immersed herself as far as her waterline. Who decides how deep a boat sinks, how high she might float, and how much sea she should displace? I think we have this hand full of pain and disappointment and disillusionment and suffering, and we have this hand full of faith, belief, and trust in a God who's the Father of all compassion, the God of all comfort. And what we do in this little boat that's called our life is we take this hand and we take this hand and we grab on to the edges of our boat, and it helps to stabilize us. Because pain and suffering and disillusionment really doesn't mean a whole lot by itself. And belief and faith and trust in God doesn't really mean a whole lot in and of itself unless it is combined with our pain, our suffering, our brokenness, and our disillusion. But when those two things come together, and we, in this boat on the seas of life, put those in our bow, in our hull, that becomes ballast, it becomes stable. It pushes us into the water, it pushes us into our own hearts and the hearts of humanity, God's heart. It pushes us in and we're immersed in the water. We're not on the bottom, we're not splashing across the top. We find our place. We find our place in our world. I don't really know any of you, but I'm making some assumptions here. That it's not just me who's broken and paralyzed and wounded and confused, disillusioned about life. It's not just me. I think it's all over. And part of the confusion for me is that I just don't get that. You know, I just don't get it. Why? But that's the thing that I don't know if I'm supposed to be responsible for finding that answer. I think what God is asking us to be responsible for in our pain and brokenness and disillusionment and our belief and faith and trust is he's asking us just to be honest about that. I grew up in a church where I learned to hide. I learned to hide parts of me because I know you guys are a relatively new church, but I had the blessing and the curse of growing up in a more established long-term church. and rules sort of develop, and this is who we are, and this is who we aren't, sort of things develop, you know? And so we were kind of happy, joyful, trusting. I'm being a little bratty here, but just to kind of exaggerate my point. Over time, there were things in my life that I struggled with, that I had sin, I had doubts, I had all this kind of stuff that I looked around in my church and I thought, I must be the only one. I must be the only one that has this kind of trouble, at least to this degree. And so I learned how to be what I thought I was supposed to be. And it sort of compromised who I really was. After my accident, I became paralyzed, and I was one of the few paralyzed people that I knew. And in some ways, it's like God allowed me to live by a new set of rules. Didn't like them all. But, I would call myself, if Lee were here, he would be mad at me right now. I call myself a cripple. I just use the cripple word because all those politically correct words I don't really like, and they don't really change what I deal with one bit. Not one bit. So I call myself a cripple, and then I call you guys normals. So I'm a cripple in a world of normals, which is a total exaggeration. But my rules feel different like this. I don't really like these stairs so much. I prefer ramps. I like flat. I like smooth. But sometimes I prefer just to spin and drop over the stairs just for fun. And I like to do escalators at shopping malls and watch the security guards freak out. So those are simple little playful rules, like the children's sermon, God likes to play. Well, I think he does, and I like to play. But on a more serious note, if we go back to this boat, and we go back to what we have in each hand that seems opposing, this is what I want to leave with you today, somehow. Our honesty about our pain and suffering and brokenness, and our belief and our trust in a God who is healing and loving, God of compassion, need to be authentically combined. Because not only do we need that, but I think God puts people in our paths every day or every week who have this brokenness and don't know what to do with it. And even he puts people in our lives that have this faith, trust, and belief that don't quite know what to do with it. I didn't really know what to do with it. So how do we bring that together? How do we find a way to bring that together? Philippians 1:29 says something like, "For it has been granted to you not only to believe in God, but also to suffer for his sake." What does that mean? We don't really yammer around too much about that verse. But it's been granted to us not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake. And so part of what I think that means for us is to be honest about our suffering and our hurts, and to be honest about our faith, and how those two grind together sometimes. To allow God to push us into the water of our world, and to be a stable little vessel that has a ballast in our hull, a faith and belief that has intermingled with despair and confusion and pain, and to be a part of our world in an authentic way, where we can listen to others, where we can feel their pain, where we can give them compassion as the Father of compassion gives us compassion, where we can give them comfort, where the Father of comfort gives us comfort. I don't know about you guys, and I'm just the one up here talking all the time, and I really would love to know what you're thinking. And it doesn't work in this context so much. But I have a strong feeling, that you don't have to look very far in your life in your day-to-day world, in the place where God has placed you, to find someone like I'm talking about, with an ample amount of brokenness and maybe an ample amount of faith that doesn't know how to put it together. For whatever balance there, we, as 2 Corinthians says, are to take in that comfort and that compassion and to find a way to give it out to the people around us in need. All right, I'm totally off script, like I said, and I'm not going back to these papers. Let's pray just for a moment, okay? God of all comfort, Father of all compassion, we come before you today and we are all in varying states of need of you. You know our hearts. And help us to trust you. To push us deeper into our own hearts. You know the people around us. Help us to trust you. To nudge us closer to their lives in meaningful, purposeful, and loving ways. And your heart, God, we just long to know your heart better. Your heart for us and your heart for the world. Whatever apprehensions and whatever fears we come here with today, Lord, help us to find ways to push past them and to enter in the living life of compassion and life of comfort, even though we may be surrounded by them. Help us to find purpose in that, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.